In 2010, a research team sequenced a set of genomes from a small group of hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, expecting to find just another data point in the growing catalog of human genetic diversity. What they found instead broke the timeline. Buried inside the DNA of these desert dwelling communities was a genetic signature so old, so deeply diverged from every other population on Earth, that it forced scientists to rewrite the branching order of the entire human family tree. This wasn't a new species. It wasn't an extinct cousin like the Neanderthals or the Denisovans. It was us, modern Homo sapiens. But a lineage of modern Homo sapiens that split off from everyone else so early that by the time he ancestors of Europeans and East Asians and Native Americans, had even begun to separate from one another. This population had already been walking its own path for hundreds of thousands of years. If you've never heard of the Koisan peoples of southern Africa, you're not alone. Outside of population genetics circles, almost nobody has. But according to researchers at Uppsala University, whose findings were published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, the Koisan carry what is currently the deepest population divergence documented anywhere in our species. Not the oldest culture, not the oldest artifacts, the oldest surviving genetic branch point in all of humanity. And once you understand what that actually means, and how scientists figured it out, the story stops being a footnote in a journal and starts looking like one of the biggest revisions to the human origin story in the last 50 years. Here's what makes this so strange. For most of the 20th century, the search for humanity's origin point was treated almost like a single location hunt. Find the oldest fossils, find the oldest tools, and you'll find the birthplace of our species. East Africa's Great Rift Valley held that title for decades, backed by fossil finds in Ethiopia and Tanzania that seemed to settle the question. Then, in 2017, a research I am led by Jean-Jacques Houblin at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, redated a set of skulls from a cave in Morocco called D. Jebel Irhoud, a site that had actually been discovered back in the 1960s, but was originally misclassified and largely ignored. The new dating came back at roughly 300,000 years old, pushing the known origin of Homo sapiens back by a full 100,000 years, and placing it not in East Africa, but on the opposite side of the continent entirely. That single discovery should have simplified the story. Instead, it did the opposite. Because if modern humans were already present in Morocco, 300,000 years ago, and the fossil and genetic evidence increasingly pointed toward populations scattered across Africa at that same time, the old idea of a single birthplace, a single Garden of Eden model, stopped making sense. Hubble himself put it bluntly when the findings announced, there is no single cradle. If there's a cradle at all, it's the entire continent. Researchers now describe the emergence of OUR species as a pan-African process, a patchwork of regional populations across a landmass the size of the United States, Europe, China, and Uruguay. They are combined, gradually connecting, separating, and connecting again over hundreds of thousands of years as climate shifted and the Sahara Itza LF transformed from desert to grassland and back again. But fossils can only tell you so much. Bones don't carry a timestamp for when populations stopped interbreeding with each other. For that, SC. Scientists had to turn to something fossils don't have, living DNA. And when geneticists began comparing genomes from populations all over the WORLD, calculating the mathematical distance between them, one result kept appearing, no matter how the analysis was run. The Koisan weren't just saint diverse, they were foundational. Every other population on Earth, every European, every East Asian, every Melanesian, every indigenous Amer Icon, traced back to a single branching event, and the Koisan lineage sat on one side of that branch almost entirely alone. According to the team's estimates, that split happened somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, meaning this genetic divide is nearly as old as the SPSEs itself, which raises an obvious question. If this branch really is that old, why did it take scientists so long to even notice it was here? The answer involves a group of hunter-gatherers who never stopped living the way their ancestors did, a genome so unusual it broke the St. Anard reference models, and a discovery that almost didn't happen at all. The 2010 discovery actually began almost by accident. A team led by Stephen Schuster and Vanessa Hayes set out to sequence the full genomes of several Kalahari hunter-gatherers, including that of Archbishop Desmond Tutu himself, who is of Bantu-speaking ancestry, alongside 4 elderly Sandmen from different corners of the desert. The goal was to build a more complete picture of southern African genetic diversity, a region that had been almost entirely absent from the global genome databases up to that point. What the team found when they copied the men to each other stunned them. The San individuals were more different from one another at the level of individual DNA letters than a typical European is from a typical East Asian. 4 men, living within a few hundred kilometers of each other, carried more genetic, a sea variation between them than exists across 2 entire continents. That result alone told researchers they weren't just looking at another regional population. They were looking at the accumulated genetic memory of tens of thousands of years that no other group on Earth had preserved in the same way. But here's what researchers didn't expect when they started digging into why. The obvious explanation, that the San were simply an isolated group that had picked up unique mutations in recent history, didn't hold up. When scientists ran coalescent modeling, a statistical method that essentially works backward through genetic data, to estimate when populations split from one another, the numbers kept landing in the same range. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, a group of ancestors gave rise to 2 branches. One branch eventually became every human population outside southern Africa, including the ancestors of every European, every East Asian, every Pacific Islander, and every indigenous American alive today. The other branch became the ancestors of the modern Koisan. And crucially, that split predates the out-of-Africa migration, the famous exodus roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago that carried modern humans into Europe, Asia, and eventually the Est of the world by more than 200,000 years. The Koisan lineage isn't just old, it's older than the very event that populated Neng. The evidence became even more surprising when researchers turned to mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through The maternal line, and to the Y-chromosome, passed down through the paternal line. Both told the same story from a different angle. Studies acing mitochondrial haplogroups found that certain lineages carried almost exclusively by Koisan populations, particularly a group of marked ERs known as L0, represent some of the deepest branch points on the entire human mitochondrial tree. Y-chromosome studies turned up something almost as striking. Researchers found that Koisan populations share some of the most ancient Y-chromosome clades with a seemingly unrelated group thousands of kilometers away, Ethiopian populations in the Horn of Africa. 2 groups separated by an entire continent speak and languages with no known relationship, carrying echoes of the same impossibly old genetic branch. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a CL GUI that the ancestors of today's Koisan weren't always confined to the southern tip of the continent. They, or populations closely related to TI and what didn't owe them, were once spread far more widely across Africa before later migrations, particularly the expansion of Bantu-speaking farming communities over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, pushed them into the more remote, arid regions where they live today. This is where everything connects. Genetic diversity within the Koisan isn't just a byproduct of age, it's a byproduct of population size and stability. According to research published in Nature Communications by Hae-Lim Kim and colleagues, Koisan populations maintained the largest effective population size of any human group for most of the last 200,000 years, meaning that for the majority of the time our species has existed, these were not marginal fringe communities. They were, genetically speaking, one of the largest and most stable human populations on the planet, while other groups underwent repeated bottlenecks, migrations, and near extinctions. That single fact upends a assumption people carry into this subject without realizing it. The assumption that oldest lineage must mean smallest, most isolated, or most primitive in some evolutionary sense. The opposite appears closer to the truth. Stability, not isolation, is what preserved the S branch's genetic depth. The bigger mystery appeared when scientists tried to figure out where exactly within this pan-African patchwork the deepest split Act2 ally occurred. Some researchers, based largely on the mitochondrial evidence alone, argued for a specific point of origin somewhere in southern Africa. But other geneticists pushed back hard on that interpretation, pointing out that the Koisan's presence in the south today doesn't mean their ancestors originated there. Population divergence, they argued, could have happened almost anywhere on the continent, with later migrations scattering the descendants of that split in different directions. The debate is still active, and it points towards something the fossil record had already been hinting at. Human origins weren't a single point on a map. They were a slow, tangled, continent-wide process, and the deepest branch in our species family tree might be the closest thing we have to a living record of exactly how tangled it really was. That's the unexpected discovery that turned this story from interesting into genuinely strange, because the Koisan's deep divergence was it's the only ancient signal buried in African genomes. Starting around 2011, geneticists began noticing something odd when they compared modern African DNA to the reference genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans. The 2 archaic human species scientists had already confirmed interbred W with our ancestors outside Africa. Certain stretches of DNA in living Africans, particularly among the Koisan and West African populations like the Yoruba and Mende, didn't match modern humans well, and they didn't match Neanderthals or Denisovans either. They matched nothing on Orai's E-cord at all. According to a study published in Science Advances by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA, roughly 2 to 19% of the genetic ancestry in some West African populations traces back to an unidentified archaic hominin, a species that has never been found in the fossil record and has no name. Researchers simply call it a ghost lineage because the only evidence it ever existed is the genet IC shadow it left behind in the people descended from those who once interbred with it. That finding alone would be remarkable on its own. But when other teams turned the same statistical tools towards southern Africa, the ghost signal came back even stronger in Koisan genomes than almost anywhere else on the continent. Population geneticist Jeffrey Wall at UC San Francisco, analyzing thousands of genomes through the Genome Asia 100K project, reported the strongest ghost archaic signal of any population, studied showing up specifically among Koisan-speaking groups. In other words, the same population that already carries the deepest branch P-oint in the entire modern human family tree may also carry the clearest trace of interbreeding with some other kind of human entirely, ASE. PC's science hasn't even identified yet, let alone named. Researchers caution this could represent a truly unknown hominin lineage, or it could be the genetic echo of modern human groups that separated from each other so early and stayed isolated for so long that by the time they recombined their DNA looked archaic by comparison. Either interpretation leads to the same unsettling conclusion. Africa's population history over the last few 100,000 years is far more fragmented and far more interesting than a single continuous lineage. The bigger implications of all this reach well beyond academic genetics, and this is where the story tends to derail into territory it was never meant to go. It's tempting, once you hear that one population carries the oldest branch in the human family tree, to start reaching for our language like purest or most original or most evolved, and this is exactly where the science needs to be stated plainly. Age of divergence is not a ranking of value, complexity, or evolutionary progress. Every population alive today, without exception, has been evolving, for the exact same amount of time since our species first appeared, because every human alive today is, by definition, a modern Homo sapiens. What differs isn't how much evolution happened, but which specific mutations accumulated along which branch, shaped by entirely different environments, different diets, different diseases, and different chance events over hundreds of thousands of years. A deep branch point tells you about the order in which populations separated from one another. It tells you nothing about intelligence, capability, or worth. Researchers working directly with Koisan communities, including geneticist Karina Schlebusch and her collaborators at Uppsala University, have been explicit about this point specifically. Because earlier, cruder interpretations of similar findings were misused throughout the 20th century to justify exactly the kind of hierarchy this research does not support. What researchers discovered next only reinforced how misleading a simple hierarchy would be. Ancient DNA recovered from a 2,000-year-old skeleton found near Ballito Bay on South Africa's coast, sequenced by a team led by Karina Schlebusch, turned out to be one of the oldest fully sequenced ancient human genomes ever recovered from sub-Saharan Africa, and it revealed something the modern Koisan genomes alone couldn't show. The ancient individual carried genetic diversity and population signatures that don't perfectly match any living group today. Me. Eating the deep Koisan lineage wasn't a single frozen population sitting untouched for 200,000 years. It was itself splitting, mixing, and reshaping internally long before any European or Bantu-speaking population ever arrived in the region. Even the oldest branch turns out to have its own internal history of divergence and reunion, layered many times over. This is where everything connects back to the linguists. For decades, a small group of researchers argued that the click consonants found in Koisan languages and echoed independently in the unrelated Hadza language of Tanzania might represent a linguistic feature stretching back, case to the very origins of human speech itself. The genetic evidence doesn't prove that claim, but it no longer looks far-fetched either. The population divergence really does stretch back 200,000 to 300,000 years. Then, whatever these communities were doing, saying G, and passing down across that unimaginable span of time, represents the longest continuously evolving cultural and linguistic thread anyone hates. What researchers are chasing next is even more ambitious than anything covered so far. Right now, teams across multiple institutions, including the Reich Lab at Harvard, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and researchers at the University of Cape Town, ARE working to expand ancient DNA sampling across regions of Africa that remain almost completely unsampled. And that gap matters enormously. Freakin' genome successfully sequenced so far represents an enormous stroke of luck against those odds, which means the picture built from the handful of ancient genomes recovered to date, remarkable as it is still built on a fraction of the evidence that exists in Europe and Asia. Researchers describe the current understanding of African population history as still being in its earliest chapters, with entire regions, particularly Central Africa and parts of East Africa, functioning as near total blind spots in the genetic record. That blind spot is precisely why the ghost archaic signal remains unresolved. Scientists cannot yet say definitively whether the mysterious ancestry showing up in Koisan and West African genomes belongs to a genuinely unknown species of ancient human, one that left no fossils we've found, or whether it represents modern human populations that separated from one another so early and remained isolated for so long that they simply look archaic by the time their descendants recombined. Answering that question will likely require finding ancient DNA direct lie from the source. Skeletal remains dating back over 100,000 years, recovered from precisely the kind of climate that makes DNA reservation almost impossible. Several teams are now experimenting with new extraction techniques, including pulling ancient DNA not from BONES, but from sediment layers in cave floors, a method that has already yielded results in Europe and Siberia, and may eventually unlock Genet-IC information from African sites that have no surviving skeletal remains at all. There's also a quieter kind of future research happening, one focused less on the deep past and more on doing right by the living co-immunities this research is actually about. For much of the 20th century, Southern African hunter-gatherer communities were studied by ampled and written about by outside researchers with little regard for consent, benefit sharing, or even basic respect. That history has started to shift. Contemporary research teams working with Koisan communities have adopted formal ethical frameworks developed in direct consultation with San representative organizations, ensuring that communities are informed about what their genetic material is being used for, that findings are communicated back to the people who contributed them, and that research decisions no longer happen entirely outside the communities being studied. It's a slow correction to a field with a difficult history, but it's also a reminder that behind every genome in these papers is a living population with its own relationship to a discovery being made about their ancestors. So where does that leave the actual question this video opened with? Scientists did find the oldest identifiable branch point in the Mahdi, or in human family tree, and it does trace back to populations connected to the Koisan peoples of southern Africa, a divergence so old it predates the migration that eventually populated every other continent on Earth by roughly 250,000 years. That's not a minor footnote in human history. It's a recalibration of how we should think about our species timeline altogether. For most of the last century, the story of human origins was told almost like a single point of departure. One place, one moment, one population radiating outward to become everyone alive today. The genetic evidence built up over the last 2 decades tells a messier, more honest story. Homo sapiens D didn't emerge from one Eden. It emerged gradually, unevenly, across an entire continent with different populations separating, isolating, sometimes reconnecting, and occasionally interbreeding with entirely unknown archaic humans whose bones we may never find. The Koisan lineage happens to be the branch that split off earliest and left the clearest genetic record of that process, which makes it less like the beginning of the human story and more like the oldest living witness to how genuinely complicated that beginning actually was. What makes this worth sitting with isn't the ranking, and it was never really about a ranking to begin with. It's the reminder that the human story is far older, far more tangled, and far less finished than most of us grew up believing. Every new genome sequenced, every ancient skeleton recovered from an unlikely corner of the continent, adds another thread to a picture that is still very much being drawn. The ghost lineages haven't been identified yet. The full internal history of the Koisan branch is still being mapped. And somewhere in an unexcavated cave or an unsampled region of Central Africa, there may be genetic evidence waiting that could push this timeline back even further than anyone currently expects. If a question like that stays with you after watching this, that curiosity is exactly the instinct NCT that keeps this kind of research moving forward. What part of this surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments, because that's usually where the next deep dive starts.